Good morning. I am Kirk Rich. I'm the current president of the chapter, and we want to say thank you guys for being here this morning. A lot of familiar faces, but also it looks like a lot of visitors, which we love to see that. So thank you for being here. It's early, but we promise we have a very good program ahead this morning. We got some very high-profile panelists that are going to talk about kind of the evolution of mixed use, which will be very exciting. So in a moment, I'll introduce our moderator and get us started. But in the meantime, I want to give you a little bit of an update on where we are with some chapter issues. Last night, just the most current moment, we just got in late last night from Washington where we did Capitol Hill visits with our congressman, doing a little lobbying, and two of the issues that were forefront for the commercial real estate world, which we've had a lot of input from our members and our sponsor, is the 1031 exchange, the deferment of taxes on commercial real estate. So we push hard to have that continued and not taken away from us, although tax reform, as everyone can imagine, probably isn't going to happen anytime soon. And then the other is the 15-year depreciation of leasehold improvements. So those were two things that we had fairly in-depth discussions. We did meet with almost all of our congressmen over the last 2 days. They were very receptive and very respectful of the CCIM designation and know who we are, and also have always reached out to us even offline to get advice, et cetera, when they're unsure of a topic. So it is a good relationship. Some things that are coming up for the chapter. We've got the Site to Do Business, which is part of the CCIM tool set that we provide to all the members. That is coming up on June the 11th, and this is a little bit of a new revamped site, and there's been some controversy because of the mail bridge and all the Site to Do Business things coming in. So I urge you to please take advantage of this training session. It's free for members. It's $75 for non-members. But if you are a member, this is a huge tool to be using, and it's incredibly strong. We had a example of it from a leadership perspective, and it is mind-boggling, the data that it has, that it pulls from. So please go to that on June the 11th if you're in town. If you're not and you want to do something beyond that, contact one of us, and we will make sure that we hook you into another regional class.
What's the time and location?
The location is going to be at the board building, Atlanta board building, and I believe it starts at 9, but we'll put that on I think it's on our website already. So if you have any questions like that, because sometimes I'm a little more ignorant than I should be, visit georgiaccim.com. Everything's on our website. And the website, by the way, is revamped, retooled, looking good. So please visit georgiaccim.com. July the 22nd, we have a fun outing that is always shorts and t-shirt, because it's hotter than hell. We do the Braves game, and we do it with the Alabama chapter, and we also are inviting some folks in from North Carolina, Florida, et cetera. It's kind of our regional event, but it's a lot of fun. It's a day game. We do a little tailgating out in the parking lot, which that's the hot part, and then we have tickets to the 755 Club, so that's the air-conditioned part. So please, if you can, join us for that. There's a small cost. If, again, go to Georgia CCIM, you can register. And make sure that you're a part of that. It's a fun crowd, actually. They bring in a bus from Alabama, and they drink the whole time that morning. So when they get here, they're a really fun crowd. Then August 13th will be our next chapter meeting, and we'll be announcing what that program will be very soon. And then we plan on towards the end of the fall meeting, we plan to do another off-site meeting. As you know, last meeting was down at the Chamber of Commerce in Atlanta, which was great. We had a sellout crowd. This one, we're hoping to do something around one of the stadium redevelopments. So we're working very hard on that to see if we can get a relationship that will allow us some inside feed on what's going on with the stadiums. So we'll let you know more about that as that unfolds in the next probably 30 days. Then the next 101 class, which is kind of the entry-level class, and this is where put the word out to the folks in your firm that want to get started with CCIM. That is coming up August 3rd through the 6th. So that is a big opportunity because those are rarely given in Atlanta. We give them twice a year, sometimes once a year. And this will be the last time this year that it's offered, and it is the prerequisite to get into the program to start the other classes. You have to take 101 first, then you can do whatever you want to do. So please put the word out for us. Then obviously we have to thank our sponsors. Without our sponsors, a lot of what you're eating and coffee and all the things that we do would not be possible. So thank you to our platinum sponsors, which are Marcus and Millichap, Bull Realty, the Simpson Company, Kitchens Kelly Gaines attorney firm. The silver sponsors are Adams Realtor, Build Right, Commercial Real Estate Show, Commercial Experts, First Colony Financial, National Property Inspectors, Standard Landscape, Stout, Kaiser and Hendrick, Strategic Exchange Advisors, and Signature Bank of Georgia, and Excelligent. So please thank our sponsors and let them know how valuable they are to the chapter. We really do value the relationships we have with them. All right, now this morning we're going to hear from a great panel, a group of panelists, which has been well put together by Michael Reeves and Leo Tzaris, our program co-chairs. And this morning the lead for that, the moderator, is Chris. So Chris, and I'm not going to say his last name because he told me how to say it and I'll slaughter it once again. He has a very unusual last name, Chris
Faussemagne.
Faussemagne.
Yep.
So Chris, you're it.
Great, thank you.
you.
All right, thank you very much. We have, I guess, three panelists with us today. We have Lyn from City of Decatur, and really more from the municipal planning side of the industry. We have Jarel Portman from JPX Works on the developer side, and we have Dalia from the architecture and programming side. So, all right. Well, let's start with Lyn. Lyn, City of Decatur was one of the first Metro Atlanta municipalities really to adopt mixed-use zoning. What do you think are some of the initial obstacles to overcome in the planning and with residents when it was initially enacted? And what are some of the concerns with residents today?
Okay. Initially, we didn't have quite as much pushback as we do today. We did a lot of planning back in the early 1980s. We had a big visioning process, so people had bought into the idea of downtown growing. The interesting thing that we found is that old Decatur tends to fight development a lot less than new Decatur. It's people who've moved in and really haven't been part of that planning process. They got theirs, now they don't want any other development, and it's really a pushback against density. So one of our challenges is to help them understand what density is, what the expectations are, and that there are limits. We have a clear height limit, we have a clear density limit. So it's just making them aware of what we're trying to do.
Gotcha. Jarel, you really have a unique experience of developing mixed-use projects at both an institutional, international level, and then also in smaller historic neighborhoods. What have you really seen the differences? And let me take a step back to Jarel. When I first met Jarel, he was finishing up a unbelievably massive project in China, correct?
Right.
So.
You would think that China is more difficult. In some ways it is, because you always have to have the Chinese government as your partner. And in that context, it takes the form of usually the contractor. So you don't really, and sometimes you don't get a chance to choose the contractor that you necessarily want. It's pretty much, this is who your contractor is going to be. So, and you can't really argue with the Chinese government, and it becomes very unsettling if you do. But I think for working inside of Inman Park, and Tom obviously was our architect and was very helpful to helping us kind of be a beacon of light of how to get through the Inman Park Neighborhood Association. We probably went through 24 public meetings, 6 architectural charrettes at Smith Dalia. And I think for a developer, one of the things that was important for us to exhibit was that we didn't have a preconceived plan. We went in and asked what the neighborhood wanted, instead of saying, here, this is what we're going to give you, this is what we think should be the development. And invariably we learned so much more by that by that request of tell us what you want, tell us what you need. And I know that a lot of developers don't have kind of the, sometimes they don't have the reputation for asking for help. And I think now within places like Inman Park and Decatur and other areas where you have just a really smart constituency, you have to basically be aware of that and listen. And so I think the difference for me was night and day. It's still very difficult to get permits and to get certain things, from the city of Atlanta. And I'm sure there's a question that you're going to ask me about that later, so I'll just stop there.
No, the one thing I'll add on that is that that we have seen is as well is that I think as a lot of people always think developers are always fighting with neighborhoods, but I think a lot of times there are a lot of great people who are involved on the neighborhood level and can really help spearhead to getting to good answers. Tom, kind of leads into one of my thoughts for you is real estate is development is always about location but often timing is far more important. As development sites have become more scarce and municipalities have more control over design through SAPs and et cetera, describe the design process and schedule of describe how the process and the schedule of these mixed-use process or projects have changed.
Thanks, Chris. Well, first of all, I think mixed-use projects have become longer and longer in development. Mixed-use developments are very complex on just about every level of the spectrum. And I think you need to begin with an experienced team. If you haven't gone through the process of mixed use before, it'll be a very enlightening experience. One of the things that we do is we are very focused around developing a schedule for the entire development. And things that are left off a construction schedule are things like financial milestones, and that's really critical to developers. Pre-construction activities, which would include zoning. Zoning is a very complex problem right now, and I think we'll talk about that a little later in the program, but the design phases are kind of linked to that zoning as the design evolves. You've got a lot of issues with the construction side, so experienced contractors that have done mixed-use developments really add a tremendous amount to the control of costs and budgets. And I think those schedules are really living documents because there are so many things that are hard to project and to anticipate in that process. And so we have a lot of float time in those schedules to allow us to move and shift and adapt to the issues associated with it. I think Chris was just telling me today that he started working on an assemblage of property in 1999. So, assemblages of properties.
Hadn't finished
Yeah, are really, really hard to do these days because sites in the urban centers are really becoming scarcer, as you are very aware of. We are also very focused on what's going on those sites. These older sites in the cities have a tremendous amount of opportunity to have terrible utility situations that you have to address. They're very expensive often, so they really impact budget. And the worst thing that could happen is for us to start a project and have this big cost overrun that we have to deal with. So anticipating that and budgeting for that and adjusting for those kind of site conditions are very, very important. We talked a little bit about programming and how it's driven a lot about through the neighborhood, interaction with the neighborhood. But excellent programming really moves a project forward quickly. And it really has to be from market-driven data. I know Jarel said that, we go and ask a neighborhood for what they'd like to see. But I have to say, we knew what we wanted to do before we did that. It's not something that is a vacuum that we walk into. We know what we need to achieve to make the financial aspects of the project effective. Parking has also become a very big profit center, and it's becoming more of a profit center in town. So managing how you're going to deal with that parking condition and how the profitability makes the most sense really affects how you get in and out of a deck, for example, or valet to the deck, and how the different uses really interact with each other within a deck. You know, zoning has become more of a campaign than a process. You know, you really have to, in a lot of cases, get down to a grassroots approach and have dining room kind of conversations and build local neighborhood champions that can step forward and help you with that process. We've seen that a lot in Decatur. But a strong architectural design also goes a long way in bringing along kind of an entrenched neighborhood. You know, in regard to the design process, the residential and commercial users really have fundamentally competing wants and needs. So, you know, residential users want sound control and security. Commercial users want to attract a lot of people and have a lively environment, a dynamic environment. And the design decisions that are made to address those kind of contradictory desires are really critical to the success of the project. So how do you keep odors and sounds away from your residences, and how do you make an environment that can sustain a level of noise and activity that would not be troublesome to those users? So that's very, very important. I think, you know, the fastest way that we found to hit a finish line in a project like this is to minimize change. And with a very complex problem like these developments, that's unrealistic to assume we're not going to have a certain amount of change as we move through the project. But if we can build what we draw and have very little interference with that process, we can get there faster. So I hope that answers that.
No, that did. That was fantastic. And it kind of, so talking about really who the people, well, I think there's kind of two things that are, that I think is really interesting. You know, from where we've done a lot of work on the west side, you have the North Side Tavern. It's kind of a lot of these icon type businesses that have been there, but they don't always fit in with kind of the new uses. Lynn, you know, in Decatur, Eddie's Attic, there's also a lot of kind of commercial that dominated the downtown area. How does the planning department kind of get involved and kind of help manage these processes, or manage these tensions almost between uses?
Right, and I think it's interesting because when you move into downtown Decatur, into these new mixed uses, you're moving into a city that's been around 187 years. So my inside voice usually wants to say when I get a call, a complaint about noise, is what part of an urban area did you not see when you bought your unit?
That's my answer too, typically, but I like that.
Because we're not really we're not talking about one mixed use. Our entire downtown, if you look at it, it's a mixed use development, and it always has been. The real tension is not so much with places like Eddie's Attic, although sometimes we'll get complaints about music playing on a patio late at night. It's really more from the maintenance of office buildings, because you've got leaf blowers, you've got trash pickup, all the things that have to be done to maintain an urban center, and residents who don't appreciate having a dumpster picked up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So a lot of what I have to do is be the mediator. And one of the things I've learned in doing this for 32 years, and it kind of gets back to what Tom was talking about too, if you're really open and honest with people about what the options and choices are that they have to make, most people, not all of them, but most people are reasonable and rational if you put it out there for them. if you actually listen to what they're saying and try to pick out what the real problem is, and then give them back, all right, well, here are my options that are available. I can ask the garbage to pick up at 7 o'clock in the morning, but please understand there are going to be school buses. And get them to feel like they're part of that conversation. And I think that goes back to the whole design thing. People can tell whether or not you're genuine when you're asking for their opinion, and they pick up on it very quickly. If you take it seriously and if you actually ask them what they want and you help them through that process of how it's going to impact them, and also help them understand that they can't have everything. You can't have lower taxes, no development, and no annexation. It doesn't work. But if you can help people understand, okay, here are the choices I'm making, here are the consequences, and let them make a reasoned, rational decision, it helps. Okay. But Eddie's Attic is never going away. It's right next to City Hall. It's where we go afterwards.
Well, good. Well, Jarel's kind of interesting on the opposite end of that. At least from part of my perspective, I sometimes think that with mixed use, municipalities sometimes trying to create a one-size-fits-all. And then a lot of times I think that, there's mixed use makes sense in certain areas there's an active opportunity for an active streetscape, but not always. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that there are certain opportunities? Do you think there should always be in kind of an urban footprint that there always needs to be that active street, or do you think in certain aspects it's better to almost just stay with a single use?
That's a tough question in the sense that I think it really, your site and your development in the area around you is going to speak to you as to what it needs to be. One of the examples is you can have a great project, but if your streetscape retail is not on point and you're missing the point of the retail, then that makes that building seem as if it's a failed building. Inman Quarter has 40,000 square feet of retail. Been really fortunate to work with Brittany McCall and Chris Carter and Gene Rice and Vantage in that, we just basically opened and we're already about 84% leased on our retail and we're 90% leased on the apartments. That retail made sense because that street was crying out for more retail. Mm-hmm. Now, conversely, there's a site that we're looking at on Peachtree that basically just needs to be, a residential tower. Right. It doesn't need that big envelope of retail. Will there be a small amount of retail? Of course, because you want to create some services for the people that are going to be living in your building. I think it comes down to looking at your area, studying your market, and seeing what's around you, and to not cannibalize anything that's around you, but to, be accretive to the situation. And I think if you can do that, then I think it makes sense for retail to be a part of your building. If it's strictly a condominium building, I don't think you necessarily want retail. I don't think that's why people are buying condominiums. I think they're buying the condominiums to have a home without having to do the yard work, and have a lovely area to go swim and things of that nature. But I don't think one size fits all. I think the last thing that you want to do is create or try to create something that's not really there. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes we get, developers are people that we love the deal. There's not a deal that you don't like. You want to build it all. You want to do it all. But, at the end of the day, you have to put a governor on yourself as to what's appropriate for that neighborhood and what's the highest and best use for that land. And how is it going to affect your citizens around you? And ultimately, I think that's the biggest change from developers from when my father started developing. There was he didn't have to go before anybody. They were like, you want to build that there? Great, please build it. Now there are a lot of hoops that you have to go through to get the right to build. And so you got to have the right vision. You got to have a great architect, which we did at Inman Quarter with Tom. And And you've got to have a great retail leasing company like Vantage behind you, and it has to work like a clock. And it's worked out. So if
Yeah.
that makes sense, sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't. It's just how prescient are you as to whether or not it's right for that area that you're trying to build in. So
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that at certain times I've seen projects that have forced retail, and it's really almost hurt what would have been a great project on the upper levels because it had failed retail, because it wasn't a retail destination. You know, if you look at the retail folks, they're trying to figure out how they even survive in a world where their business models are being kind of completely torn apart by online purchasing and whatnot. So I always think in certain areas in Inman Park and Inman Quarter is a great example of how it can work. You know, one thing I think you guys did a very good job with on that project as well is that you know, every facade looks different. So for you mentioned 40,000 square feet on that site, but it doesn't feel like 40,000 feet. It does feel like it still kind of feels like a small village. So that's good. Absolutely, please do jump in.
We found that same thing, and we're doing some apartment development now along Commerce Drive, and we didn't want retail because Commerce Drive is not a retail street. We had found that with the Artisan. The main thing is really more the design, and I know Tom would agree that it's more about activating the street. So what we asked the developer to do was to make those residential units on the ground floor accessible from the sidewalk, so they have stoops that people can walk out on. But we wouldn't want retail there because it wouldn't have been successful. And you're exactly right. The last thing you want is empty retail, or get the reputation that retail can't make it in downtown Decatur.
Tom, one of the, I think, you know, a lot of these new sites that people are talking about to build these new mixed-use buildings, a lot of times there's already something there. Your firm has a long history with historic preservation in addition to mixed use. How do you approach a project where there's a historic building on a site where a client wants to create a newer and denser project on that site? And what's the tension of, golly, you know, that's a beautiful old, 1910 building versus, okay, you know what, this site can take a lot greater density?
Yes. Well, I think it's a little like Jarel's question. It's going to be a case-by-case evaluation. I'm a student of history, and I grew up in New Orleans, so I grew up in a mixed-use development. And somehow I survived that experience. And I arrived in Atlanta in '87, and I looked around, and adaptive use was really in its infancy in 1987. And so, you know, we began a focus on adapting a lot of older buildings. What was left, actually, Sherman did a pretty good job. And, you know, I won't go into the other aspects, but, you know, historic buildings are a link to our past, and I've always found them to be elements of an urban fabric that need to be celebrated and retained as part of the cultural qualities of our society. So we work really hard to find ways to retain and bring new and creative life back into these structures. So you've got to have a good use to keep them. And many of these buildings, you know, apply. You know, you can get tax credits, facade easements, and things like that that really help financially make these projects happen. And I'm sure these guys have a much better handle on how helpful that is to a pro forma. But having said that, and this goes to the case-by-case thing, I would say that a lot of buildings don't significantly contribute to the history and the culture of the place that they're in. We've all seen those. They're not critical to maintain, and the space is often needed to evolve that part of the district or the city. So I think removal of these buildings in the right circumstances are very appropriate and actually lend themselves to change and improvement in those areas. So I think that's.
Yeah, and I you know, to kind of echo that real quick, we had worked with Tom's firm, Dalia, did the White Provision project that we developed, and really big question there of, we either had the opportunity to make a great mixed use environment by extending 14th Street onto the site, but the trade-off of that is we tore down 50,000 square feet of really great historic building. And so I think that, I think a lot of times there's kind of the answer sometimes lies in the middle. So that's good. Let's see here. One of the things I think is interesting is all these kind of things are changing is, we've kind of talked about mixed use, the retail and all that, but really the occupants. And, I think is this, and I hate using this term because it's already overused, and I'm sure that it's going to be overused for the next 10 years, as this millennial population continues to expand. Everyone's trying to figure out what they're looking for, and everyone's determined that, they want to live in apartments. I think what's going to be interesting is when family formation happens with a lot of these folks and they start having children. They're already they're part of that urban footprint. From kind of a planning perspective, how do you, as a municipality, how do you kind of deal for that? How do you get ready for that? Do you work with the school board, or how do you work with potentially this change of all of a sudden when you look at all the units that are coming online,
Right.
What happens if all these people start having children?
Yeah, it's an interesting tension that we have with our school board. Stop smiling back there, Bill. With our school board right now, for those of you who may know, if you know Decatur, our school system is bursting at the seams. From a city perspective, I say that's a great problem. Let's figure out how we're going to deal with it. The other side of that problem would not be a good way to be. Our school system, though, tends to take the direction that we should stop all development altogether. Because we don't know how many kids are going to move into those buildings. What we have found is that, at least in our condominiums, it's 60 and 70% empty nesters. It's people moving from the suburbs. It's people who amazingly are relocating because they want to be where their kids and their grandchildren live, which boggles my mind. I cannot even imagine my mother and father picking up and moving to be near me. It didn't happen. My mother still lives in the house she's lived in for 50 some odd years, and she isn't going anywhere. She's 88. But they do. They move to be around, and we're seeing some millennials moving in, and they definitely will be going in to the apartments. But what we're seeing is that those folks, as you alluded to, I think once they start having children, they're going to start looking for single-family or townhouse types of development. The thing that the condominiums have done for us is that they've actually begun to free up some of that single-family housing market. Because until we built the first unit in 1999, if you were aging, you wanted to sell or downsize, you wanted to get rid of the yard, there was no option in the city of Decatur. And it took us 7 years to find a developer to build the first condominium, and he sold every unit before he broke ground. Didn't do a market study and assumed it was going to be millennials, young professionals. It was almost all empty nesters. And of those, the great majority of them already lived in the city of Decatur. So for us, it's just creating a mix of housing options. Our real challenge, I think, for millennials looking for housing is the affordability, because we are very small. We're 4 square miles. We have very little opportunity for developing new houses, and we're losing all of the great affordable small starter houses. They're getting knocked down for $800,000 and $900,000 mega mansions, which is so unlike Decatur. It's something we're going to have to deal with. But the school system, again, I go back to my helping people understand what the options are. And if you're a school system and you're growing, you have to pay for that. And you cannot pay for that without increasing the tax digest. And the way that we do that is to develop commercial property or develop on commercial property. We have a very limited amount of it. And right now our tax digest is 85% single family, 15% commercial, and I'm including condominium developments, anything on commercial property. That's way out of whack. And we cannot continue to maintain that and be sustainable. So it's just constant conversations and education with our school system.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm going to jump back to Tom here, just because you said something that on the affordability side that brought up another point is with the design of these buildings and structures, it's become a lot more complicated. When you said when you started, a lot of it was adaptive reuse, and so you had the benefit of having the structure in place. A lot of times it was going in with some great design, but you're able to capitalize on that existing structure, whereas now you're having to build these very complicated concrete hybrid structures. By the time you finish it, you look and go, well, golly, they're going to have to pay us $2.20 a foot in rent to make this deal work. In areas where you try to find more affordable projects, from a design perspective, how do you address that? How do you design a project so that when it's finished, you're still able to put some money into the facades and have a project that the community is going to embrace and that you're going to be proud to have as part of your portfolio?
Well, again, you have tough questions, but as far as costs are concerned, I've only worked with one client that said money was no object, and we were able to talk them out of that pretty quickly. There's limitations to everything, and we've been able to achieve quality materials in our projects and application of those materials, because I think we really focus on finding cost-effective building systems that are readily available, mostly locally supplied, and you never see in the building. So if we can get the infrastructure of the building for a good value, a good well-made, but a good value, then we leave some of that budget for creating strategically placed components that are made of high-quality material. And if you got to pick your battles, but if you can find these little surprises as you move through a complex, we call them memory points, because it's what people take away from a development, and their impressions are that this is really a high-quality development where, we've been really under a lot of burden to create that appearance. On the other hand, it's no secret that good architecture performed better in the recession than commodity product. That's been confirmed with my clients over and over again. When you talk about density, zoning ordinances create a volume of space over a site that you're allowed to build in. And the natural inclination for developers is to build as much as that volume as they can. And so our job as designers is to moderate that approach as much as possible. We don't have a lot of power in this process, but we're convincing and stubborn. And so you've got to accommodate housing, you've got to accommodate retail, office, parking, and in general, and you have to create spaces that are very interesting and that are separate in a way to react to some of the things you were saying, Lynn and Jarel. And that's going to have an impact on density. But I think in a skilled hand, you can manipulate that big volume to create, beautiful buildings, and without having a significant impact on density, or whatever impact on density that you do have is paid for in the long run by acceptance and popularity and the general acceptance of the project.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to finish up one question, or one last question to Jarel. We were talking a little bit earlier. I think Inman Quarter is probably one of the best projects done in this city in the past decade. And I talked a little bit about the challenges of working with the neighborhood and really working with the neighborhood. I always laugh when someone looks at a site and they're like, golly, that deal was a no-brainer. And they don't know the 2 years of conversation, of conversations that happen in order to get it to that point. As the current cycle matures, and based on the time it takes really to get a deal going from initial pro forma to kind of that exit, what do you see as the challenges for mixed-use projects that are in the initial planning stages today?
I would think that the challenge, considering the volume that's coming on, or the volume that's been reported as far as multifamily, there hasn't been much condo conversation. We're in that conversation, which kind of like being early in things, but there's also risk with that. But I think the key is to differentiate yourself from all the other product that you see, that you can kind of gauge what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, because when you have a lot of merchant commodity and you have a lot of similar options, the only way I think you cut through that is to be dissimilar and to be unique in what you're offering, and to do that, it takes a little bit more time with your architects and with your retail brokers, if you're in fact putting retail in it, and then having that that view of what it is that's going to make this unique and make someone go, I want to be there instead of there, and that's the hard part, but that's also the fun part, and I think if you have if you have a great team and you have a great architect, and you can create great spaces. And again, I think the space and I think the site speaks to you. And if you're not hearing the right things from the site, then it's probably not the site for you to develop. And if you're really excited by what you can see in your mind's eye as to what should happen, and then you can get an architect like Tom Dalia to help you, with that vision, and you can also get the input from the neighborhood, because, frankly, they're going to give you the insight that you don't really know because you don't live there. If you do all those things and you truly have a great market study, then you know where the pocket is, and either you're going to slide into that pocket and be different, or you're just going to build something that everyone else is building and hope that you get your part of that market share. And for JPX Works especially, we're not really interested in that arena. We're interested in doing things that are different, even if it takes us longer. I mean, to us, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I don't need eight deals a year. I just don't. I want to do things that are really special and that are accretive to the city and to its citizens, and hopefully we'll continue to do that.
I think those are great points. A kind of great thing to close is, I think in general, the business will always have cycles, and I do think commodity. When you look at real estate is a commodity, but when you look, as Tom alluded to as well, over the past decade, well-designed mixed-use projects always seem to be the one, in good locations always seem to be the one that have succeeded. So I think those are good points, Jarel. Any questions of any of the panelists? Yes.
Direct with the Lyn, in the city of Decatur, and I'm on the council in Carroll Supervision, it's slightly smaller, but still some of the same problem. When you have a development, a mixed use that's going to add 100 units or 200 units or whatever, high rise, how do you address that as far as utilities, your sewer, water, services and things of this nature? Have you guys gone off to the terrible language of impact fees, and is that some of that handled by the developer, or is that pretty much handled by the city?
Well, we're blessed in downtown Decatur that most of our utilities can handle the growth. They were designed that way. Stormwater is one that is probably our oldest system, and we do have a very strict detention requirement, so that is in effect an impact fee. We also have streetscape requirements, so they have to pay in to build the streetscape according to our specs. So we've just run into an issue with sewer, And that's a DeKalb County issue because we're building now on a side of downtown that doesn't necessarily have the capacity. And part of what we're dealing with DeKalb, and we're working, fighting on the developer's behalf, is that they are being charged an sewer tap fee for every unit, even though there's one tap, which to us is an impact fee. I get that. But now they're wanting the developer to also pay to upgrade all of the sewer lines. So it's something that we're going to have to look at, and unfortunately the city of Decatur doesn't control that, but we are arguing and advocating on the developer's behalf.
Anyone else?
Don't everybody rush.
Right. Yes, in the back.
Jarel, how did you guys come up with your retail boxes for the Inman Park project? Just like with Lynn, I think you guys have a very unique environment for retail in that it's not typically national folks. So how did you come into that understanding of your retail?
Mostly the IP&A said they wanted to keep Inman Park weird. And so that made it, more of a challenge in the sense that they didn't want the national brands, and we didn't really want the national brands as well. So it does make the leasing job harder, and I think having Vantage as our brokers, they've got such a great and have pioneered kind of the in-town local, whether it be a restaurateur or chef, specialty stores. For us, they were the perfect partner because they were tied into that milieu of clients and were able to, help us curate what we saw as keeping Inman Park weird at the same time creating things that didn't cannibalize one another. And to have Ford Fry on one corner and Bar Taco, across the monument stairs from him, which is part of Barcelona, which is across the street, and them putting their wine store, which is the first one that exists. And then MF Sushi. I mean, when you have this kind of exterior retail, unlike the malls where you have Bloomingdale's, Macy's, Saks, and Neiman's as your drivers, you have Ford Fry, you have MF Sushi, you have Bar Taco, and you have Cakes and Ale. And so those are, when you have an exterior retail component, those are your drivers. And so what you want to do is you want to obviously get really great local retailers and restaurateurs to fill in the spaces around those behemoths of local talent, and I think that that we've done a great job at achieving that, and really look forward to when they're all open, which should be hopefully in the next couple of months. But I think you have to dig harder. You have to think outside of the box. And I'm glad that Inman Park basically made that a requirement because if you look around the country, streets like Abbot Kinney in Venice and Union Street in San Francisco and Crosby Street in New York City. I mean, those are great retail streets, but you don't feel like you're surrounded by these big chains, and you find these little jewels, and that's really what Inman Park is a jewel. And so you want to try and to make sure that who you put there is also a jewel. So
I'd like to just add quickly to that. When we talk about the evolution of mixed-use development, which is the basis of this conversation, Jarel's point about curating the space, both from a residential standpoint, but also really finding uses that work so well together. And Jarel's done an amazing job with that. Vantage has really assisted in that. And Chris, you did it over at White Provision. I mean, it was That's what makes these places very special. So I think the curation of your commercial uses is really the future. You've got to just have a great game plan for that. Architecture, I always like to talk about that, but that's also been a topic that's been moving on. And if you look at Pond City Market as really the next phase of the mixed use, certainly on a massive scale, that same process is happening. That entire complex has been really carefully curated and put together, and I think we'll see the impact of that certainly on the old Fourth Ward for decades to come.
And I just want to add too, I couldn't agree more, and actually I look back and think that's what my 32 years in Decatur has been. I hadn't thought of it as being a curator, but it's really having to pick and choose what's going to work. We have fought the battles where we've had retailers and restaurants come in. We have flat out told the developer or the landlord, this will not work, we do not want them, and they fail. Our real challenge, and I think when you were talking about what's going to be successful, it's going to be projects like yours, because what people are looking for is an experience, and we spend a lot of time and money on creating a different, unique experience in downtown Decatur, and that can't be, you can't just put that down as the last thing you think about. The problem that we have with our newer developments is a lot of that retail gets sold off as a condominium, and it's to an owner out of town for us, and that owner is filling it or wants to fill it with whoever the first person is that comes in that has a bankable lease or is a name that they know and they feel comfortable with, and we constantly are fighting that because we want to be weird. We are weird. We'll take Inman Park on any day as far as weirdness, but that's what makes us special. That's what makes Decatur different from any other place that makes people want to come back and visit. So it's a constant struggle, and we really need to support those local retailers, those local businesses, and try to figure out ways to put in rents that they can at least get their foot in the door to be successful in the early years.
Yeah, I mean, and one kind of on that, on the rent thing is that a lot of projects that we'll see, people will say, oh, I want all the retail that Jarel's curated at Inman that we've done on the west side, and then they'll put rents that only a national brand can pay, and so there's just tension there. Sometimes you have to kind of work with those people. Like the hardest thing that we've ever done is in 2009 when the world was falling flat and you're leasing space and you're still turning down 80% of the people that want to sign leases with you because it didn't fit in with the overall goal. But I think that's kind of, again, what has to happen in order to kind of create, make sure that retail works. And if the streetscape works, a lot of times I think that's why people want to live there or they want to work there. So then all of a sudden it works its way up the building. We have time for one last question if it's quick. Or not. All right, well...
Chris, I wanted to ask.
Sure.
I'm going to ask Tom, how does transit-oriented development play into the future of mixed use?
Well, I think everybody can respond to that. Maybe you, Lynn, might even be the best one. But it's absolutely essential. And I think Atlanta has recognized that. And I think there's been a cooperative spirit coming out of MARTA that has assisted that process, and it's always good to see some cooperation out of MARTA. And we just think that if you're not paying attention to the locations around MARTA stations and mass transit, I think you're missing something significant.
Yeah, MARTA is. It's taken us 30-something years for it to actually be an asset, but it is amazing. We have 3 MARTA stations in 4 square miles, and I take my hat off to the leadership of the city of Decatur, our elected leaders who stuck with it. You didn't know that it would take quite so long, but we have people now moving into the city of Decatur because of access to MARTA. And I couldn't agree with you more. The whole development attitude at MARTA has changed. They basically killed a project that we were working on in 2005 at the Avondale MARTA station because of the number of different approval levels we had to go through. We wound up losing the project. Now it's a new day, it's a new leadership, and we are fast tracking on a mixed-use development on the Avondale MARTA station parking lot. So we're looking forward to it. I think we're going to see more and more of that.
All right. We have anything else? Nope. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you to the panelists.